Welcome to the Football Reporters. We have an emergency episode today because we've got big news from Tottenham. Daniel Levy has stepped down after 25 years as executive chairman. It's massive news in the world of football. Daniel Levy's been such a huge figure at Tottenham, a huge figure in the Premier League. So James Olley's been reporting on what's happened, why it's happened, how it happened. James, what's the story?
Well, I think everybody always thought that Daniel Levy would determine the timing of his own departure from Tottenham. He's in his early 60s. He's been in the role since March 2001 and has established himself in that time as one of the world's most respected administrators. Whether you like him or not, the legacy is there for all to see. The new stadium was masterminded by Daniel Levy, the state-of-the-art training ground too. But the issue has always been with Spurs is how many trophies come along with it. And of course, he's only masterminded or overseen 2 trophies in those 24 years, the most recent of which came this summer with the Europa League. But it's really not quelled the frustrations, both in terms of within the fan base, but also behind the scenes. And I think there's sort of 2 strands to this, really. There's obviously the very public protest from a section of the fan base that seems to have got bigger, I think, over time, frustrated that they sort of get in this cycle of getting close to winning and close to challenging for the biggest prizes and then never quite getting over the line, obviously the Europa League notwithstanding. And then, of course, internally, where there have been a lot of changes behind the scenes at a hierarchical level at the club this summer, and a lot of conversations about the future direction of the club, which have also influenced this decision and the timing of Daniel Levy stepping down.
I mean, I'm just reading the statement that Tottenham put out on Thursday evening. I think a lot of stories these days, there's always a bit of a whiff around, but this was a shock. I don't think anyone saw this coming, certainly the timing of it. But one thing that struck me about this statement, now, Daniel Levy, as you said, is a very divisive character, not very popular amongst Tottenham fans. Within the statement, it says the club has competed regularly at the highest level, enjoying a number of fantastic on-field successes, including the recent Europa League. But now, maybe my maths is wrong, but that's 2 trophies in 25 years. I don't see many fantastic on-field successes. And then Daniel Levy himself says that we have built this club into a global heavyweight, competing at the highest level. It's almost like there's a lot of self-serving nature about that statement. That doesn't really cover the reality. Yes, he's been fantastic in terms of being an administrator, building a stadium, making Tottenham the most, I guess, sustainable club in the Premier League. But when you run a football club, you also have to have a bit of ambition. And is it fair to say that over the years, his ambition has always been outweighed by his determination to balance the books and keep a very tight ship?
Yeah, I mean, and that's been the leading criticism of him, isn't it? Is that, all of the sort of ambition that they've shown off the pitch with that stadium, which is one of the best in the world. It's innovative. I mean, it's sort of remarkable to think it's 6 years old, because you go there and it almost still feels absolutely brand new, and that has become one of the world's most prominent and sort of celebrated venues, because of course they have a lot of concerts there. They can host F1 events there. It's got a fully retractable pitch, which is, a remarkable innovation. And then the training ground, Jose Mourinho, when he was head coach there, he waxed lyrical about how luxurious the pillows were and how wonderful it was to stay there. And the whole club, they felt, as though they geared themselves towards success off the field. But I think the fans just feel that hasn't been replicated on the field. I would say, to defend Levy a little bit here, in the article I've written, I went back and looked at the net spend of the last 5 years. And actually, there's only 3 clubs that have spent more in terms of net spend in the Premier League than Spurs in that time. And if you look at it as sort of a graph, it's been a significant increase, sort of post-COVID, really, that they have started to invest more. Where they've not sort of kept pace or caught up with their rivals is in terms of wages. I think it's 42% of their revenue is spent on wages as a percentage. That is much, much lower than a lot of their rivals. There's nobody at Spurs who's on more than around about £200,000 a week, which is obviously a huge salary in sort of ordinary money. But when you're thinking about the very top end of the game and the biggest rivals, you want to go for the Premier League, you want to go for the Champions League, your rivals are paying more than that. The top players are on double that and more in some circumstances. So there has been that sort of feeling that he's not quite shown the level of ambition on the field that he has off of it. And that, of course, was a source of criticism that, led to many managers getting trapped in that cycle. We mentioned Mourinho, Antonio Conte. I mean, even if you go back to Pochettino, his most successful manager in terms of sort of sustaining their presence at the top of the game, reaching the Champions League final in 2019. If you look at a lot of his public press conferences, his utterances around that sort of the end of that time, he talked about Spurs needing to think like a big club and go to the next level, and all these sort of thinly veiled, thinly coded messages for we need to spend more money. And of course, they didn't do enough. And if you go back to the Harry Redknapp era, sort of 10, 12 years ago, when they were top of the league at the turn of the year, it's always the sort of, example that's used that Harry Redknapp wanted them to go and be aggressive in the market, and he wanted Gary Cahill and Carlos Tevez, and he ended up with Ryan Nelson and Louis Saha on free transfers. And of course, they didn't sustain their title challenge and they fell away. And it's always felt as though they've not quite taken that step, those extra steps to go and say, right, we are here, we are going to compete, and we are going to back our manager. Even if financially it's not the most prudent decision, we're prioritising the football. And I think that's the sort of gear change that those behind the scenes now want to make.
Just on the stadium in particular, James, do you think that Levy gets the credit that maybe he deserves for that? Because it's one thing having the ambition to do it and to build a stadium like that. And I think Man United is showing at the moment how difficult it is from going from a drawing on a piece of paper to actually kind of having a stadium like that realised, getting the funding, getting the people behind it, everything you need to get that over the line. Do you think that he gets, or he's going to get the credit that he perhaps deserves for delivering that for Tottenham?
Well, he doesn't speak very often publicly, certainly for interviews. He obviously gave one to the Overlap this summer. I actually did his last newspaper interview in 2019. And even then, when the stadium had just opened, he was sort of talking about the challenges that they'd faced in that period. Obviously, the United Kingdom had voted to leave the European Union, and Brexit had inflated the costs of that build in a way that they didn't anticipate. Suddenly, a lot of the materials, a lot of the labour which was coming in from Europe was 20% more. And the price really did increase sort of exponentially. And then, of course, within a year of the stadium opening, COVID happened. And then, this whole revenue stream that was built around major, mass gatherings in an arena, concerts, and obviously the matches themselves were not taking place. So it was a huge sort of double blow around that time that Spurs had to navigate their way through. And of course, that was going to impact them financially. They used a Bank of England loan facility that was specially created as a result of COVID, that again attracted a lot of criticism at the time. They renegotiated a lot of their debt to favourable terms, which now, with the interest rates on the sort of long-term debt the club has, they look very, very good. I think at 2.5%, something like that. You try to take a loan out now, even for a small amount of money, and it's going to cost you probably double that or close to it. So all of these things that obviously fans don't go to the pub and talk about interest rates, but it's one of those things that in that Overlap interview, he said, well, maybe one day when I'm not here, I won't get the credit. Maybe I'll get the credit when I'm not here that I don't get now. And it does feel a little bit like that. I think anybody who walks up the Tottenham High Road to go to a game has Daniel Levy to thank for that. Now, of course, if they go up to that game and they lose to a team that's getting relegated, like Leicester City in January, when there were all the banners that came out and the protests, really reached fever pitch towards Daniel Levy, then you can understand the frustration. But it's the bricks and mortar that's his legacy. It's, unfortunately for him, it's not the on-field success.
I mean, in terms of his legacy, you're right about the stadium, but there are other things as well. I mean, within the game, as we know, he's got a reputation, and it may be overblown. I don't know about it being a tough negotiator. I mean, the classic stories of Sir Alex Ferguson telling David Gill after signing Dimitar Berbatov, we're never dealing with that guy again because he forced United to pay an extra $4 million for Berbatov and they didn't want to pay it. But the flip side is that, this is a guy that sacked Jose Mourinho the week before a cup final against Pep Guardiola's Man City and put Ryan Mason in charge. So in terms of judgment, you have to question that. But what I want to ask you is, how powerful really was it? Because he had several sporting directors over the years, but it ultimately wasn't his club. It was ENIC, Joe Lewis. He was basically doing their bidding. So was it always his final say, or was the power from upstairs that was actually really the power behind the throne?
Well, it's funny because Harry Redknapp once told me a story that when he was going to pick a team for a game at Old Trafford, that Joe Lewis had contacted him to sort of suggest perhaps maybe picking one player over another. That was always denied by Spurs, who sort of said he was never interfering with anything like that, never involved in the day-to-day running of the club. So it sort of depends who you speak to, but I think generally, Joe Lewis and the Lewis family took a back seat. Daniel Levy ran that club with near total control. He had the final say over many things, including managerial appointments. Obviously, if he probably had to get sign off for those from Joe Lewis, but I think it was a sort of fait accompli in most cases. He would say, look, I want to replace Pochettino with Jose Mourinho, and they'd say, do it. He made the decisions. And significantly, I think even this summer, if you speak to sort of people who dealt with some of the transfers in and out of Spurs, that even though they had Fabio Paratici acting as a consultant, they had Johan Lange, of course, as technical director, Daniel Levy was still a prominent presence within that. And I ghostwrote a book of an agent that came out a few years ago, where he sort of told a story how the agent's brother, who was also an agent, he got phoned up by Daniel Levy one morning on deadline day and just said, right, what are we going to do today then? He sort of had that kind of real appetite to do a late deal and to get involved and get his hands dirty in a way that a lot of chairmen and chief executives don't want to. His departure leaves a big hole that needs to be filled.
Because he gets involved because he wants that control. It's not a case of just trying to help out. It's because he wants to control. He wants to be the power guy, isn't he?
And the control. Look, I mean, the control element, I think, is another factor behind his departure. Now, we have to sort of be careful how we talk about this, but sources have told me that there have been conversations going on around a possible takeover of the club for some time. And there were some that I've been told within the club who felt that Daniel Levy's approach to those conversations were slowing them down and perhaps complicating things. Now, I've put this to a source very close to the Lewis family who've denied that and said that the decision with Daniel was taken on sporting grounds. And you only need to look at some of the people who were going in. So Joe Lewis's daughter and his son, Vivian and Charlie, and his grandson-in-law, a guy called Nick. Those three have now kind of got onto the board and become more of a prominent presence around the club. And I think what the Lewis family are trying to sort of say is, well, this is the next generation. I've been told categorically by them that the club currently isn't for sale. That they haven't been negotiating with a view to selling, but more with a desire to bring in fresh investment. I have different information to that. Make of that what you will. But it is interesting now to see what happens in the next few months, because if what I'm told is right, then it would have to stand to reason that without Daniel Levy being such a controlling presence, it would make the path to fresh investment a little bit easier. And whether that leads to a sale further down the line remains to be seen, of course. Spurs are valued at around about 3.5 billion, 4 billion on a good day. That's obviously a huge amount of money for anyone to take on, but there are interested parties who aren't put off by that valuation. So whether Daniel Levy's removal or his decision to step down, as I suppose officially we're supposed to call it, accelerates those conversations over the rest of this year and into next year, it is definitely one to keep an eye on.
I suppose one thing that lots of the fans will, particularly the fans that protested against him. And I was at the City game where there was quite a loud protest from the travelling Tottenham fans because they just lost out on Eze to Arsenal. I suppose lots of the Spurs fans will hope, I suppose, that Daniel Levy stepping down or leaving, however you want to sort of term it, will kind of trigger this different approach to transfers and the wage structure, and maybe the purse strings will be loosened a little bit. Just from what you know and the conversations you're having with the club, do you genuinely think that is what's going to happen now? Will there be a marked change in how they approach the transfer market? I
spent a bit of time with Spurs on their pre-season tour in Asia, and I certainly got a sense from some of the senior people there that they're going to get more aggressive with their wages. I think we saw in Randall Kolo Muani, that loan deal, I think we saw perhaps a sign of their increased agility and ambition there. I mean, all right, Kolo Muani's lost his way perhaps a little bit, but let's not forget that, 2 years ago, PSG committed 90 million euros to sign him from Eintracht Frankfurt. And he had a pretty good record at Juventus last season, and the expectation was he was going to go there permanently. But when that deal collapsed, Spurs moved very quickly to move in to get him on loan with no option or obligation. And again, that was sort of seen as a bit of a criticism at the time. But you sort of think, well, Spurs in the market habitually act with contingencies. They go for slightly younger players, and they might try to negotiate an obligation or an option that's cheaper up front, to sort of have that in place and know where they stand. Whereas they've taken a little bit more of a gamble with Kolo Muani because they don't have any option or obligation at the back end. If he does really well, they will have to pay more to sign him on a permanent basis. And you could sort of argue that both ways. You could say, well, is that a bit of mismanagement? Or is that in the final 48 hours of the window when we're looking to salvage what had been a frustrating window for them? You mentioned the Eze deal. Of course, they missed out on Morgan Gibbs-White as well. That actually they're trying to gamble a bit and twist rather than stick with their squad. So I think we will see something of that. We're yet to know exactly what the new structure is going to look like in terms of who's going to be doing those deals. Obviously, Johan Lange is there. Whether Paratici comes back in a more sort of formal capacity, I think that's something that the club will probably review in the coming weeks, certainly ahead of the January window. And then whether it's a case of any of the Lewis family who are sort of stepping up, or Peter Charrington, who's now the new non-executive chairman, whether he comes in and takes a bit more of an active role. I'd be surprised because he hasn't got a football background. His background's in finance. He was working at Citibank for 26 years. So I don't see him being someone who's immediately going to come in and sort of take over the Levy role, if you like. So yeah, I think they will get more aggressive. I think they know they need to. And of course, they have the headroom because, PSR-wise, they're comfortable. And as we've talked about already, in terms of the squad cost ratio is a big thing with UEFA. Well, they're really comfortable, in satisfying that. So they have the headroom to be aggressive. And I think the intention is there to do it.
James, what's the role of Amanda Staveley at Tottenham? Because we know that she was at Newcastle for a while, helped bring the Saudi PIF to the table. She was involved in takeovers in the past at Liverpool, I think, in several clubs. So she obviously has a role, or previous as a fixer, certainly with Middle Eastern takeovers. So should Tottenham fans be looking at her with significance as a potential? I know what you're saying about the family said there's no takeover talks, but her presence there suggests that there might be stuff going on.
Yeah, I mean, as I've said already, I think have been takeover. My information is there have been discussions about a possible takeover, and Amanda Staveley's name is one that keeps sort of coming up in those circles. It does feel as though at the moment the mood music around Tottenham is that there isn't anything imminent regarding a sale. I think I suspect what's going to happen now is they'll kind of park a lot of that talk for a while. And Amanda Staveley might be someone who tries to renegotiate or help fix a deal that sees fresh investment go into Spurs. And as I said earlier, that would dilute potentially Daniel Levy's shareholding at the club and therefore his exit if they do sell overall in future. And I think that's probably where they'll look to go. I think they'll look to try and get some fresh investment in the club, see where that money and those contacts and that influence takes them. And then, of course, in an ideal world, right, that pays off. And then the club is worth more than 4 billion if we're talking about that being a top end price at the moment. And then, of course, everybody wins if they do just decide to sell next year or the year after.
James, before we wrap up, just put you on the spot a little bit. What would you say Daniel Levy's biggest success and his biggest failure at Tottenham over the years?
The biggest success is the stadium. They had to overcome so many things, and it was a brave call to start with to keep the club in Tottenham. There was a school of thought for a while that, and obviously they looked at moving east to the old Olympic Stadium, which is of course now the London Stadium, West Ham's home. And at the time, Daniel Levy sort of said, "Well, look, if we're going to go there, we need to knock it down." And everybody, I remember at the time, everybody thought he was crazy because you sort of said, "Well, no, hang on a minute, this isn't a stadium that's been built. It's there. It's ready to go. Yes, it needs modification from an athletics arena to a football stadium, but it's a stadium and it's obviously can house a football pitch and, it can be facilitated as such." But he was absolutely adamant that stadium had to be knocked down. And you'd have to argue, I'm sure there'd be many West Ham fans even who might agree with Daniel Levy. I mean, we've all done games at the London Stadium where you're so far away from the pitch. it's quite remarkable that it was never sort of more heavily modified than it has been. So he decided to keep them in North London. They had years of battles over the buying up the property, and as we talked about already, the inflation costs caused by Brexit and the delays that inevitably come along with building a stadium. But that stadium will, stand not only in 2019 as one of the best in the world, but it still does now. And I think, as I've said, every time a fan goes to that stadium and enjoys their match day experience, they have Daniel Levy to thank for that. I think his biggest failure was probably after the 2019 Champions League final. Spurs had got so close. They obviously had a manager and a group of players who were on the same page, playing great football, had gone close in the Premier League under Pochettino as well, and had reached the Europe's biggest club game and had fallen just short. And instead of kicking on, instead of making sure the environment was there for Pochettino to go and build on that success, if you could call it that, the club stagnated. And of course, by November of that year, he was out of a job, and he appointed Jose Mourinho in a move that just did not work out. And the club have never really recovered from those heights. So I think that would be his biggest failure, would be just, again, taking that final step. And ultimately, that's probably what has cost him his position.
Just one final one, James, and I'm sure that a lot of Spurs fans, given the news, will disagree straight away. But do you see any kind of world where, I don't know, in 2 or 3, maybe 5 years, that whatever Spurs fans are expecting to happen now Levy has gone doesn't happen, and maybe those same Spurs fans are looking back on Levy's time in charge at Tottenham and maybe sort of reassessing it and maybe wishing that they had? Will he get the overall credit, perhaps after he's long gone, than he is today? Is there any kind of case where Spurs fans may look back on that and go, actually, we may have treated him a little bit harshly?
I mean, possibly. Look, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because if they go on to succeed from here, then history tends to be kinder to people in those sort of circumstances. So maybe people will come to look at him. It's a little bit like if Thomas Tuchel goes and wins the World Cup next year for England. People could look at Gareth Southgate and say, well, he held that team back and they should have won it before now. Or they'll say, well, actually, he basically is standing on the shoulders of Southgate there. He's done all the work to get England into a position to be able to win a tournament. And then the guys come in and got them over the line in Thomas Tuchel. I think that's what they hope is going to happen now, that the Lewis family and those who are now going to become the key decision makers at the club can build on what Daniel Levy's done and take the final step that he couldn't. Of course, if it goes the other way and Spurs slip into sort of mid-table mediocrity and maybe they do spend a load of money, but they do it badly, and suddenly the wage bill is bloated and they're stuck with players who are either not good enough or don't want to be there, then you start to look at that era differently, and you might say, well, yeah, we had it good then, but also what a missed opportunity that was to go and take that final step. And, will we ever get back there? But I think what Daniel Levy would probably argue in response to that is the foundations that he's laid, the sort of overall financial position of the club means that they should be solid enough to have a go. And then if it doesn't work, have another go before they're in real trouble, if that makes sense. So I think he'll feel that he's set them up for long-term success. It's just that the success has always just appeared a little bit too far over the horizon and not in front of their eyes. And the challenge for the Lewis family is to bring that into view now.